introduce you to Chris Hoofnagel, who is from the University of California, Berkeley, Boalt School of Law. And he will tell us about behavioral advertising, something you cannot refuse. So let's welcome our speaker.
So it's delightful to be up here in Sonoma. I was telling George and your other faculty that I've been up this way a number of times and really have enjoyed the trip and even recognized the way in some of the wonderful stores and wineries you have up here. So it's a real pleasure to come up and speak with you today. I'm trained as a lawyer. I have no training in computer science. I made a huge mistake as an undergraduate, and I was really interested in technology and the internet, and I was on the internet pretty early, and when I was in college, I was the only undergraduate who had a website on my college's servers. But it never occurred to me that the internet was a real place that would bud into this incredible platform for commercial opportunity and for sharing things and for having new experiences. I thought it was just kind of like a toy, and it was a big mistake. I really regret not leaving school and moving here and working in the .com world. My friends who did that did really well. Instead, I studied classics and eventually went on to law school. But at Berkeley, I've done a number of studies with undergraduate students concerning web tracking. So, and let me at least look at my slides so I can make sure I have my bearings here. So, the idea behind this talk is that it's half substantive, but it's also just half procedural. And what I'm going to ask you to do is to consider how you can contribute to this field that I'm working on that we're calling web privacy measurement. It's basically trying to quantify how web services track users and enumerate that tracking in a way that's consistent and rigorous over time. This is really straightforward work, and it's work that you can do. It's work you can do in the span of a single semester. You can look at how websites are behaving or how services are behaving in a rigorous way and put out data about these problems. George and I were just talking on the way over about the problem that there is so little descriptive information about many of the basic problems in computer science, particularly in malware. It's very difficult to write about malware as a legal academic because it's so difficult to find basic descriptive information about malware that is reliable enough to quote in a journal. And so the challenge, and what I'm going to try to persuade you to think about is whether you can do some of that descriptive research and talk about how web services, excellent, thank you, sir, so much, how you could gather data about web services and contribute to this field. So what I do in this context is just straightforward privacy measurement. It's not really of interest to academic computer scientists because it's basic. It's very basic, and it's descriptive. However, and what we've done in California is we've at UC Berkeley is we've put together teams of undergraduates to work on these issues, and it gives them an opportunity to define the field they're studying, to come up with some scientific method of how to study it, to collect data in a rigorous way, and to do analysis. And because the subject matter is understudied, and because it's available to all of us, it's basically how the web works. How the web works is available to you. Figuring that out is something you can do. It's a research that can be done in the context of seminars or other classes. Another point here is that at a conference down at Stanford a few months ago, Ed Felton discussed the need for basic descriptive research in internet privacy. and its lack of availability, the inability for us to say, for instance, is there more web tracking today than there was 5 years ago? No one can answer that question. It's a pretty basic question, can't be answered, right? As a result, policymakers cannot test whether different policy approaches work or not. So one of the things I'm working on is the idea that if we can create rigorous and regular observation of how websites track users, we might be able to inform policymakers, and they can decide whether different approaches are more or less effective in curbing tracking online, if that's their goal. I mentioned earlier that this field is not so interesting to computer science professors. I still think it's there is neat intersections with computer security that are worth thinking about. For instance, when one looks at how the web is working on popular websites, we basically have ubiquitous tracking. One of the things we've been able to study and document is that Google basically can track pretty much any web interaction because Google trackers are present on almost all websites. At 97 of the top 100, for instance. And then when you go deeper into the web, they're still present at a very high percentage. There's also an interesting opportunity to find new examples of tracking technologies in the wild. So in this past year, we were able to discover the use of e-tags, which is a type of kind of cache tracking. You're literally using the user's web cache in order to track them. We were able to find that on popular websites in the last year. It was a practice that used to really just be limited to pornography sites and similar places. I think one of the things that's interesting about this field is that the new tracking methods being used by websites look more and more like hacking and wiretapping. And I'll have some specific examples of this. But quite literally, the reason why I talk about this as behavioral advertising, the technology you can't refuse, is that the new innovations in web tracking invalidate user choice. They make it impossible for you to say no. And they can even make it look as though you've said no, but still track you across websites. So one of the basic aspects that we've tried to elucidate is that there is a path that advertisers and other tracking companies are following as far as technology goes. We started out with cookies. It seems like most consumers know what cookies are. The very limited form of tracking, we know that the storage in a cookie is very small. You can only get 4 kilobytes. Cookies expire by default when you close a browser session. There's other limitations to them. For instance, they can only be accessed by the browser that the user is using. And so in 2009, we wrote a paper about how flash cookies were being used by popular websites. Have any of you heard of flash cookies? So we have some Flash developers, some people who write ActionScript. Yeah? No? Some, okay.
Heard of them in the context of tracking.
Okay, so one of the aspects of the Flash program is that it allows developers to store information on the user's browser. And this was originally conceived of as a way to do things like store settings. So for instance, if you knew a user wanted his or her volume to be 50%, you could create a little Flash cookie that would say volume, and you could set it at 50% or whatever the user wanted. But advertisers soon figured out that they could inject other variables and other very long strings into Flash cookies and use them as a tracking mechanism, in part because they can store up to 100 kilobytes, so a much larger amount of space. They're permanent by default. They don't get erased. They're stored outside the browser, which the reason why that's relevant is that if you are using Google Chrome and you get a Flash cookie, and then you later turn on Microsoft's Internet Explorer, the Flash cookies you got while using Chrome will be read by Internet Explorer. So they're shared across across browsers. So in 2009, we talked about flash cookies and how they were being used by advertisers. And then finally, in our most recent paper, we've been talking about the advent of HTML5, which is really, it's a fantastic technology, needed to happen, but it has some new interesting aspects as far as tracking goes, so enumeration of individuals and following them across the web. They can store a lot more information. So anyone use Gmail? Imagine pretty much everyone. Gmail uses HTML5 to store your email locally on your computer. So if you have a network interruption, you can still access your email and compose, etc. It's very useful. It can store up to 5 megabytes by default. Stored in SQL. It makes it easy to study. And it's only used by the browser. It's a really neat technology, in part because if everything goes right, we won't need Flash anymore. HTML5 will knock it out. One of the things we found back in 2009 in doing our literature review, we looked at how advertisers were talking about tracking users. And one company that we focused on was called United Virtualities. And they started to say, we're worried that users are deleting their cookies. They're deleting their cookies, and it's making it harder for us to target advertising, blah, blah, blah. We've adopted this new element we're calling the persistent identification element to track users. So we kind of got together, my colleagues and I got together, and we looked at how they described it. They said it's tagged to the user's browser, unique ID here, can't be deleted by anti-spyware, can't be deleted by adware removal. Well, what could this be? And we looked at their website, we looked at the types of advertising that they were using, and it was clear that they were using Flash to deliver ads. And that kind of led us to the idea that their tracking element was actually through Flash rather than through standard scripting. So, as a result of that, we went out on the internet and quite literally took a sample of the 100 most popular websites according to Quantcast on a specific day. You can go out and download that list. And we created a browser that would crawl those 100 sites, make arbitrary clicks staying on the same domain, and then collect the cookies that show up. And between each website, so site number one is like msn.com or something like that. The browser turns off and clears its cookies between going to each site. So this is how we maintain control. And back in 2009, we found that 54 of the top 100 websites were using some type of Flash cookie. And that in itself doesn't mean that they're tracking users using Flash. But I'll have some other statistics around that that are pretty interesting. And of course, there's cookies, standard HTTP cookies, on almost all top websites. The only two that don't have it are Wikipedia and I can't even remember. It might be related to Wikipedia, but there's literally only two sites that in the domain of popular websites that do not put cookies on users' browser. And of course, a lot of these companies had trustee privacy seals, yet they were using Flash cookies. And almost none of the companies disclosed the fact that they were starting to use this new tracking vector in order to enumerate users. But the most interesting thing we found from this study, and it relates back to, see, I pressed the wrong button there. That gives me right click. Let's see. It relates back to these claims, and it doesn't matter. It relates back to these claims made by United Virtualities, is that the company basically claimed they found a way to track people that could not be prevented. So we started to reverse engineer how that might happen. And what we found is that we could open up browsers and we could look at the values in standard cookies and see that they started to match the values in Flash cookies. So we started to suspect that what was happening is that the Flash cookie was backing up a standard cookie. And sure enough, what we found was that if you went to websites like AOL, they would assign you this unique identifier that looks like it's unique. I mean, we can't really say whether it's unique. It would get duplicated in Flash by a company called ClearSpring. It's an advertising company. So what we do is we keep our Flash cookie, but erase our standard cookies and go back to the website and see what would happen. And sure enough, after 2 clicks, it gets rewritten. So we call this Flash cookie respawning. I mean, we're like trying to talk to the gamers in the room. You know, when you shoot the enemy's dead, yet they come back to life. It's called respawning, right? Some people call it instantiation or re-instantiation. Some people call it cookie backup. So advertisers have different ways of talking about this behavior. But basically what this does is it gets around users who decide to delete their cookies. And it's long been, yes?
Where is the Flash cookie stored?
This is on my Mac, so it's users, username, library, preferences, macro media, and then there's like 2 different folders and I can't remember which. Our paper describes exactly where they're stored, and of course it's different if you're on a PC. By the time 2011 came along, we're actually using Linux to do this too. This is very basic approach we used the first time around. So the idea that in the public policy realm, and this is where like my involvement made a lot of sense as a lawyer and as someone who's worked in DC for a long time. Listening to advertisers say, well, if you don't want to be tracked by advertisers, you can delete your cookies. If you don't want this stuff, you can delete your cookies. Well, that all starts to get a little hollow. It starts to ring hollow if they can reverse engineer your choice decisions through technology. 2 years later, again, with a team of undergraduates, 3 undergraduates from across the nation, we actually have a program at Cal where students can come study for the summer under a National Science Foundation grant. So we have these students for 8 weeks. They come in typically with CS or information science backgrounds, sometimes without that. And we say in the next 8 weeks, what we're going to do is we're going to design a study and we're going to publish it. We're going to go from beginning to end in 8 weeks because we're going to look at this relatively simple issue. How are websites tracking people? How are the top websites, the most popular websites in the US, tracking people? So this year we had a really fantastic group of students who were literate in Python. And I learned a little bit about virtualization. So what we basically did is we virtualized a Linux computer, and they created all sorts of scripts to drive the browser within the virtual machine, go to website 1, collect the cookies, export them in a format that was easy for us to analyze, then delete all those cookies, reboot the virtual machine to a clean state, blah, blah, blah. We did that 100 times for the top 100 websites. It's a great learning opportunity because despite all the effort we went to think through the protocol and to write out a protocol for the study, we found errors in the protocol after we did our first data collection. So after the students had stayed up all night crawling websites and looking at the data, we looked at it and we said, there are things missing here, and there's things missing that we know that there's some kind of error afoot. And they had to go back and diagnose the error, reprogram the system, and do the crawl again. So it's a neat learning opportunity about how to maintain control and integrity in data collection. What we found was, after our 2009 study, a whole bunch of advertisers were sued for using Flash cookies. Basically, there's a federal hacking law called the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. And these advertising companies were sued under that law. Plaintiffs' attorneys alleged that they, without authorization, changed settings on people's computers by using Flash cookies and this respawning technology. A bunch of those cases settled. So a bunch of advertisers paid out a lot of money for doing it. And one result was that when we went back and we looked at the top 100 websites, we saw a remarkable decline in Flash cookie use. We just saw only 37 instead of 54 were using Flash cookies at all. And there's other kind of metrics in there that are important. We look at things like cookie names. If the cookie name is volume, right? The Flash cookie name is volume, and the value is 86. That's not a unique identifier, and it's probably not being used for tracking. So one of the things we do is look at the cookie names and whether the actual contents of those cookies look like unique IDs. But we saw a lot less of that on top websites. We did find that 2 websites were still responding. Interestingly, one of the 2 was Hulu.com. I don't even think they knew they were doing it, and I'll explain how it was occurring. I don't think they even knew. And Hulu.com had recently settled a lawsuit for respawning cookies, and then 3 months later, all of a sudden, they're respawning cookies again. One point here is that there's all sorts of websites now that are worried about these technologies. They might have a relationship with 15 different advertisers, and they don't know what those advertisers are doing on their own websites. So if any of you want to start a consulting firm, one thing you can do is test websites, test your own clients' websites to make sure that their advertisers aren't going haywire with tracking and are performing under their contracts. It's now a legitimate business to do this. So we saw a big rise, so we decline in Flash cookies, but a big rise in standard cookies. I think we found like 6,500 cookies altogether, and 5,000 of them were from third-party hosts. We detected about 650 third-party hosts planting cookies on browsers, and that seems to be consistent with other researchers who are trying to determine how many advertising companies are out there tracking people. We think the number is about 600 companies. Huge concentration. Yes?
Is that 600 advertisers?
They're not all advertisers. Sometimes they're optimization companies. So sometimes they're companies that specialize in making sure an ad actually gets delivered. So for instance, I could create a site, like a link farm, and I could put 1 million ads on it. And if you clicked on it, I would get 1 million impressions. Well, so there's companies that will get in the middle and make sure that that doesn't happen. Some of them are just metrics companies, not always advertisers. But then again, a lot of them we don't know what they are. They could be governments. We don't know. Huge concentration in tracking. As I mentioned earlier, we found Google trackers on 97 of the top 100 websites. And this includes government sites like irs.gov. Okay, get this, when you go to irs.gov, you get a Google tracking cookie. It's pretty awesome, when you're doing that search, when you're trying to figure out how badly you messed up your taxes. Google can see those click-throughs, good for them. And then we saw a fair amount of adoption of HTML5. We found 17 sites using HTML5, and some of them would duplicate values. So between HTML5 and standard cookies. So this is pretty important because if you deleted your normal cookies, but HTML5 could then back them up, there could still be unique tracking over time. The new tracking vector that we found is e-tags. It's a property of the cache. So you all are probably familiar with the web cache. Do work around what caching is and its uses and benefits. Advertisers back in maybe like 2003 figured out that they could take values out of the cache and use them to track people. And it was generally, the technique was only used by kind of fringe websites. But in our, in this study, we found a company called Kissmetrics, which is a pretty popular metrics company that was using this script to uniquely enumerate people over time. And so if you wanted to avoid this tracking, let's say you were very privacy sensitive, you'd have to not only block cookies and all that mess, you'd have to clear your cache between each website you visited. One of the interesting things about this approach, the Kissmetrics approach, was that it used the same identifier for each user across different websites. Okay, so I might be user 1234, and when I went to Hulu.com, I'm user 1234. Same identifier when I went to Spotify, same identifier when I went to GigaOM. And so one of the points we made here, and I think this is where my contribution was important just as a lawyer rather than a computer science person, is in the regulatory world, consumers seem to be concerned about information about them being sold to third parties. So you go buy something from a catalog, or you go to a store and you buy something and they know who you are. One of the concerns that consumers understand is that that company might sell the data to a third party. Well, this system allows sharing across third parties in a way that's not obvious to consumers. So for instance, let's say that you don't really trust Spotify, so you give them a fake email address when you signed in. One of the things Spotify could do is say, I have this user 1234. Spotify could go to Hulu and say, what information do you have about user 1234? Is their email address this email address, or is it something else? So you can, first parties can then aggregate information. They can buy information or share it amongst each other. One company that was using Kissmetrics was Spokio. Are you all familiar with Spokio? This is like link farm, terrible website that just kind of aggregates personal information. Well, they were using Kissmetrics. So if they had a Kissmetrics cookie on you, they could link their aggregate data to at least some of your web browsing. So this is just more examples of this. We took our unique string, our uniquely assigned string to our browser, and we could show that the same value was present at Kissmetrics, something called SEOMOZ.org. I'm not sure what that is. It sounds like, I don't even sure what it is. Spotify, Spokio, GigaOM, Etsy, ShoeDazzle, a whole bunch of other websites would then have the same identifier to attach information. We've started to do projects around whether or not consumers can realistically detect and avoid web tracking. So not from a normative frame. This work doesn't say that web tracking is good or bad. What we're trying to ask is, how does web tracking occur? How much of it is there? And we frequently add in whether or not it's possible for people to avoid it. And these are studies that can be done with in a single semester with teams of students who are devoted. There's huge policy effects from it. The Europeans in particular have been really interested in the studies we've done because having basic descriptive data about how websites track individuals is very valuable in the policy debate. They can, the lobbyists come in and say, oh, we give people a choice, and oh, there's no problems here, blah, blah, blah. They can pull out these pieces of paper and say, well, wait a minute, how is there a choice if you're backing up their cookie using HTML5 and e-tags and whatnot? How is there a choice there? And increasingly, what I'm working on is the idea of enumerating web tracking more broadly. So I'm starting a project at Berkeley, and I think we're going to release it in the next 2 weeks or so, where we routinely crawl the web, a very deep crawl. I think we're going to the top 1 million websites, counting cookies, HTML5 cookies, Flash cookies, other vectors for tracking that we suspect are out there. And we're going to routinely, every 3 or 4 months, release data about how much tracking there is on the web. And what we're hoping is that data will help policymakers determine whether or not interventions are, whether they're law or self-regulatory policies, whether they increase or decrease the amount of web tracking out there. And in a real sense, the amount of privacy individuals have on the internet. So with that, that's basically the project I've been working on. If anybody has any questions, or if this is work you want to do here, I think it's really something to think about. I mean, for instance, you could do work here. You could take teams of students over a semester and look for the prevalence of malware in advertising. So there's a study out there by Gartner Gartner is a for-profit consulting firm. It's a very good firm, very trustworthy. However, there's still a for-profit security consulting firm, right? So they have a study out there about this problem, but how can we really be sure that it's objective, right? You could write an objective report going to, let's say, the top 1,000 websites, clicking on advertising on those top 1,000 websites and analyzing the images and scripts for malware and just releasing a report. This is how much malware we found. And it's an easy hit. It lets you learn the scientific method in a real sense and understand the type of controls that one has to have around a crawl like that. And it can have a real public policy impact when we have real data around that's trustworthy and it's not generated by a for-profit entity. It's, by the way, trying to sell you, some type of service. So if anybody has any questions, I'd love to hear them. Yes.
You mentioned Google tracking on, for instance, irs.gov, and my guess would be that that's related to, say, Google Analytics or something of that nature. Can you speak to that at all? Is that?
It could be. I can't remember. Okay, so that's in our report. So Google has analytics. So sometimes the Google cookie is an analytic cookie. Sometimes it's a double-click cookie. When we say that Google is present on 97, we're combining the two, but they do not overlap completely. There's like 14 sites that have analytics that don't have double-click, and there's sites they're Google competitors generally, right? That often don't have the Google cookie. But when you go deep into the web, it's really my colleague Ashkan Soltani wrote a report in 2009 where they looked much more deeply. They looked at 400,000 unique domains, and they found Google trackers on almost 90% of them. It's a remarkably deep penetration. That's awesome. Yes, sir.
Have you done anything like categorize the different types of websites? For example, this being an election year, I would be curious to know how many political websites are in this.
Well, it's funny that we found two websites responding. One was Hulu, the other one was Fox. Okay, but I don't even think Fox knew. I think it was Fox. I'm pretty sure it was Fox. We were using a widget by a company called Polldaddy. And it's another one of these things where you're a web designer, you're like, we want this feature where we can just put a poll up and people can vote on an issue of the day. So let's use this company called Polldaddy. Well, it turns out the way they're preventing people from voting twice is through flash cookie responding, right? Or, they give you a flash cookie. If they see that flash cookie come back, you're not allowed to vote. Well, that's flash responding, and you all of a sudden you've installed this widget on your website. And I'm not sure that it was Fox. It was a political website. I'm feeling bad because I can't remember. But you're a web designer. You put this widget on your website. And then boom, all of a sudden you have all sorts of crazy liability that you never really thought about. And so this is my point, is that those of you who want to go start a consulting firm and test websites and help websites come into compliance with norms around web tracking, it's one can make money doing it. It's a worthwhile field. Yes, sir.
So I was just curious, do you do anything with mobile as far as looking at carrier IQ or anything like that? Or even applications that are like individual that track, moving from page to page and stuff?
So my colleague Ashkan Soltani has done a lot of that work, and they've built a tool. They did it for the Wall Street Journal that collects all the data flowing from an app before it goes up to the tower, and there's some pretty interesting stuff going on there. In part because that transmission was encrypted, and they found a way to decrypt it. And this is it's actually one of the more interesting aspects of this, is that you can focus on the substance of what you find, or even the methods. Like, what is the best method to deal with the problem that an encrypted app or some encrypted session is also engaging in some type of tracking that users might find transgressive. I don't do mobile, in part because I am not familiar enough with the technology to work on it. So, yes, sir.
Do you do any with HTTP or with secure, like HTTPS?
There are ways of, well, first of all, this is a great question. One of the reasons why we don't have more HTTPS on the internet is that it breaks third-party advertising networks. So let's say you want to be a good actor and you're CNN.com, and you want to make sure that all your transmissions have integrity and people aren't doing bizarre attacks. So you turn on HTTPS. Well, what happens as a result is all your ad networks, when they show up in the sidebar, you get that pop-up that says some of the
it's not secure.
some of the content on this page is not secure, and people hate that, right? And then all of a sudden they think, well, maybe my computer's been hacked, or etc. It causes the user to become upset. So no one wants to do that, and so we've benefited from this lack of security. If the web turns over to a HTTPS everywhere type of situation, I think there are ways in which we can deal with it. We'll just get a certificate authority and man in the middle attack it. But we don't have to do that yet. Isn't that bizarre? It's an interesting problem. Yes, sir.
You were talking about how some websites communicate in order to establish users across multiple websites. How much evidence have you seen for like a central repository of users that once identified by one of those tags is created like a centralized, is that exist?
Something that's totally worth studying. And if you can figure it out, you could write really interesting reports about it. So one standard practice among a lot of websites is to use a server-side cookie sharing or enhancement. So you have a user and you go to a company like Axiom and you ask Axiom, what do you know about this user? And you get extra data. That all happens on the server side. We cannot observe it. So yeah, and it's also it's probably kind of expensive. I mean, one way we could study it is just by doing it, right? We could just buy an account and start enhancing cookies and see what comes back. It's not something we've looked at, and we know it's out there. I mean, it's a really interesting problem too, because this is kind of a lightning rod privacy problem. People feel like they're on the internet. There's a certain amount of awareness that they're being tracked and they're getting advertising, but things change. I mean, if you tapped that user on the shoulder and said, did you know that this website they're taking this registration information about you or this cookie about you, and they're tossing it over the fence to Axiom and learning that you have this income, or that you live here, or that you're interested in this, or you're interested in that from offline databases? That's the type of collision that causes people to become very upset about privacy. So, and I think that's the last question. I think we're out of time. Or you're moderating, huh?
No, could be more questions.
Okay. Yes, sir.
What legal action could a person or company take against a distributor of malware or viruses today?
So it would depend on what you meant by distribution, and it would depend on how the malware was applied or used against an individual. There are, for instance, selling wiretapping tools. Tools designed for wiretapping can be prohibited by federal law. And the standard law that one would use in this context would be the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. So that gives you a right of action against someone who breaks into your computer, breaks into some type of computer system. But in order for you to sue, you have to have $5,000 of damage. You have to be able to show $5,000 of the damage. And you might be able to. You might, maybe someone breaks into your computer systems and then you have to hire a forensic expert to figure out what happened.
Is that to keep it out of the small claims court?
It's to stop petty abuses of the statute. And so, for instance, one of the first suits in 2000 and 2001 were against cookies. You put a cookie on my computer, I'm going to sue you for Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. I did not authorize you to put that cookie on my computer. Now, if I could go to court on that, the courts there would be a lot of cases, right? So Congress put this $5,000 threshold in. so that only serious abuses would be addressed. And the other vector to think about is state computer crime law. Almost every state has a computer intrusion law. They tend to be very broad. So broad that at least one of them has been struck down as being void for vagueness. It's so broad you can't even tell what it prohibits. Okay, stalking laws, identity theft laws, you might be able to use as well. So, yes, sir.
Those first lawsuits, the ones with the cookies, was that before browsers had the option to keep cookies and stuff like that? Or it was just automatically put on the computer?
I can't remember when cookie controls were introduced. About when do you think that they were introduced?
I don't know browser history at all.
Pretty
It's been around
early.
a long time.
Pretty
Because I mean,
early.
if you allow cookies and you're allowing them to put that on the computer, you can't really sue them for that, I don't think.
Well, so there's the technical argument that my settings allowed this or not. So that's one way to think about it. And then the other one is, what does the privacy policy say? And the also, I think there's an issue of who is setting the cookie. And so the first suits were against DoubleClick in 1999, 2000. And that's a situation where you go to whatever, Amazon.com, and then all of a sudden you're getting DoubleClick cookies from this third party. So the plaintiffs argued that it was as if a third party had picked up the telephone and had listened in to the conversation. But the courts looking at those first cases said, no, it's not like that at all. It's like you called Amazon, and Amazon said to his sister, why don't you pick up the phone line too and listen in with me? So it was seen as Amazon giving consent to the listening in. So it was just one, or how are we with time? Okay, yes, sir.
Yes, as far as browsers go, did you notice a difference between any of them when you were testing, or did you try?
That is something that we had early in our protocol that we never ultimately did. Several other researchers have been looking at differences in how browsers handle cookies, and there are important differences. I will botch this if I do it off the top of my head, but there is at least one browser that will allow a reading of a cookie, even if you put your setting to accept no cookies, it will still allow cookies on your computer to be read. So if you are using that browser, you first have to delete all your cookies and then click accept no more cookies, and then you'd be in the state of zero cookie use. Other browsers have policies that prohibit the reading and writing. I can't remember which ones. So, thank you for having me.